Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that the following episode contains the names of people who have died. This episode also discusses descriptions of violent crime, interpersonal violence, and sexual assault. Please listen with care.
A listener production.
Why? It's the question that draws so many of us to true crime. Why would someone kill? What drives a person to stalk? Are some people truly evil? Are good people capable of terrible things? We grapple with these questions, trying to make sense of the unimaginable. Is it their childhood, their biology, or something more complex? These aren't just the questions we ask. Detectives, forensic psychologists, and criminal behaviour analysts have spent lifetimes trying to understand the minds of those who commit the unthinkable. In this episode, we'll hear from these experts. This is Crime Insiders, what we've learnt about the psychology of crime. To begin, Crime Insiders Detectives host Brent Sanders speaks with Ricky Hennessy, a recently retired New South Wales homicide detective. Ricky has confronted some of the darkest minds, including Malcolm Naden, a serial killer who evaded capture for 7 years after murdering 2 women, one of whom was his cousin, 24-year-old Letitia Nolan.
We often hear, don't we, Ricky, people, are they born bad? Are they bad individuals? What makes somebody do something that what he has done? Good people can do bad things.
I couldn't agree more.
Is Naden a bad person? Is he a person who's done bad things? Are there mental health issues there? How would you assess him?
This is something that has fascinated me and probably what kept me in homicide for as long as I did, or why people commit murder or why they do what they do. And I've read a lot about it. I'm certainly no academic, but born bad, made bad, what's the difference? How does it happen? I find it fascinating. In Malcolm's case, I think it was a combination of his environment and mental health factors. I don't think he was born bad, but certainly I recall there was one period of time where he turned and looked at me on the banks of the Macquarie River when we were looking for Letitia. And it was quite deliberate. He said something which I can't say for legal reasons to me, and it was designed to shock me, and he looked me dead in the eye. And I thought at that time, that's what evil looks like.
That veneer had dropped away.
Yeah, and I'll never forget that. It always makes me think, if people believe in good and evil or whatever beliefs you might have, I just remember thinking at one point, that's why people probably think when they see people with that look in their eye, that's probably why they think there is evil in the world. But aside from that moment, Malcolm to me was, as I said, normal. He was quiet, he was articulate, well-spoken, considerate, joke. If you'd met him on the street, you would not suspect him of the murders he committed.
That's such an interesting observation, Ricky. And I was talking recently, I met a detective who worked on the Ivan Milat case. And he said something to me and it really resonated, and I think it might resonate with you, Ricky. I'm not sure. He said, when you walk into the interview room to meet someone for the first time who's done all these terrible things, he said, you, even as a seasoned police officer, you create almost in your mind a desire or an expectation that when you walk in there, you're going to be faced with almost the devil incarnate. The bloke's going to have a tail and horns. And he said, I opened the door to walk in to speak to Ivan Milat, and there was this puny little quietly spoken bloke, nervous on the other side of the desk, very polite, standing up, shaking hands. And he said you almost want them to be the depiction that they are in the movies and on TV, because so often, and I can just speak briefly in my experience, so often when you meet these individuals who have undoubtedly done terrible things, oftentimes they don't stack up to society or even our own expectation of what they're going to be like.
I couldn't agree more. I've considered something similar many times in my career with some of the people that I've had to interview.
Mm. You talk about evil folks. Yeah, Ivan Milat, you worked on the case with his nephew, Matthew Milat, who was convicted of the homicide of a friend of his, in fact, in Belangla State Forest, where his uncle so infamously took the lives and buried all those other folks. You worked on the Matthew Milat case. I think, if I'm right, that you interviewed one of the co-accused.
That's right, Cohen Klein.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Cohen Klein is a mystery to me in that I just cannot understand how an 18 or it might have been 19-year-old would seemingly happily go along with the plan that you're going to set up someone that you know and been around town. They live in the same town of Bargo together. How you'd happily go along with a plan to set him up to execute him and video record it. I just still to this day I can't get my head wrapped around it.
You'd look at somebody like Milat Matthew, who I think evidence has shown he did take the life of that friend. He in a terrible way. He basically decapitated him, I think, with an axe or something such as that. Pretty gruesome. You can look at that action as being the actions of somebody who's just, we talk about being bad. I mean, that's out there. But interestingly, you say you can categorise that, but it's the co-accused, it's the enablers, if you like. Where do they fit into that whole thing? Are they taken in somehow by the psychopath, if you will? I don't know. What's the connection?
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, and unfortunately, I don't have a lot of insight to add in this case. It's just something that has absolutely confounded me. Matthew Milat, as you say, I think from memory, the psychiatrists who examined him did say that he had psychopathic traits. I have no doubt of that myself, knowing other things about his history. But Cohen Klein, prior to this event, the murder of their friend or so-called friend, he was a kid who hung around Bargo smoking pot. That was, he was, and I don't know, maybe that was it. He was nobody in the scheme of things.
Yeah, became besotted by the Matthew Milat world, and I think you're right. Neither you or I are a psychiatrist, but he would on a psychiatrist's couch, I think, tick all the boxes of a classic psychopath. No remorse, no nothing. You walk into an interview with someone like that, as you said before, Ricky, even working at the sharp end as you have homicide, you don't meet too many people who are bad to the bone.
No, they are rare.
But if you walk into an interview with a Milat, is that someone who you're thinking, they got ice running through their veins? They're wired up differently, some of these individuals.
Well, I believe there is, from what I've read, genetic connection. Something like 5% of the population are born psychopaths, but not all of them go out on their days to murder. The Milat family name obviously has an effect.
Yeah.
And during that investigation, I was struck by the effect that the Milat name has on the people of the Southern Highlands. And it was interesting that Matthew actually changed his name from Matthew Muleman to Matthew Milat.
Okay.
When he was a teenager, because he wanted
that connection.
Name.
So Klein was quite instrumental in getting the conviction, or did Milat himself actually openly admit what he has done, no remorse, almost proud of his actions?
Milat and Klein initially both denied any involvement in the murder. Even when I interviewed Cohen Klein the night after the murder had been committed, he was still maintaining that he had no idea that Milat was going to go and kill their friend. And he basically just tried to talk himself out of it.
When you have two co-accused like that, and oftentimes you have one who very much is the leader, is the instigator, the other is more enabler, a bit of a follower. Is it fair to say, Ricky, that it gives you additional leverage in an investigation where you have two people who you can interview separately and and you would get perhaps more leverage in an interview with a Klein than you would with a Malat. Would that be a fair comment, that it provides the investigators with a little bit more leverage because you have two offenders that you can work with, working one off another if need be?
It can work to your advantage, absolutely. Just by virtue of the fact that the more information you have, the more you can try and elicit. So it was definitely beneficial to have not just Malat and Klein to interview, but the fellow that they took with them. So yeah, we obviously had the benefit of all of that information to put to Klein. Malat actually declined to be formally interviewed, but he would later write letters, poems, I think from memory, where he basically glorified his actions and, as you say, demonstrated absolutely no remorse. And those letters were tendered in evidence at court, not just to prove his guilt, but also during his sentencing.
1 in 7 Australians have been stalked. This figure is even higher for women. It's a crime that often hides in the shadows, underreported, under-prosecuted, but alarmingly linked to almost every other major offence. But what motivates someone to stalk, and what can we do to stop them? On Crime Insiders Forensics, host Kathryn Fox spoke with one of the world's leading stalking experts, Professor Troy McEwan. Professor McEwan reveals the psychology behind this insidious crime and the 7 profiles stalkers often fit into. Take a listen.
The first thing I'll say is that behaviourally, most stalking can look fairly similar. It kind of divides up into 2 broad things: angry, intimidating, threatening; desperate, loving, pleading. Okay, that's your kind of 2 versions, if you like, of as a victim. That's the kind of 2 things you might experience. But if you're looking at it from the other side and looking at why is the person actually engaging in the stalking, it gets a little bit more complex than that. So a useful way of thinking about it is thinking about the idea of motivation, or the kind of the function, if you like, of the stalking for the person. And in that context, typically we talk about kind of 5 different groups of motivations. They're not completely mutually exclusive probably, but it's a helpful way of kind of just organising your thinking, basically. So the first group people tend to think about your rejected ex-partners. Yeah, so they make up they're a big single group, probably the largest group by themselves. And so they're people who their stalking begins after the end of a breakdown of a relationship, usually an intimate relationship, but potentially also maybe like an estrangement in the family or an estranged friend, breakdown of a friendship. You could get rejection after that. Even in some cases, a very close therapeutic relationship. We've had a long-standing therapeutic relationship with a doctor, a psychiatrist, psychologist, this kind of thing, and that breaks down and the person feels rejected. But the bulk of that group is an intimate sexual relationship. And it breaks down, and one person usually doesn't want it to have ended, or alternatively, they are so hurt by the ending that they decide to take revenge, if you like, on the ex-partner. I need to hurt you the way you've hurt me. And so quite often in that group, the stalking actually almost becomes like a substitute for the relationship for those people. They're enacting the relationship on their ex-partner, even though their ex-partner doesn't want to have anything to do with them. And so that's a really tricky kind of situation. And often it flips between this desperate pleading, loving, I just want to say sorry, I just want you back, I just want us to be back together, it was so perfect. And then when the other person doesn't do what they want, then angry, threatening, intimidating, and then, oh, I'm sorry I did that. And you get this kind of flipping in the emotional kind of presentation. So that's kind of the biggest group. And I think that's probably the group a lot of people think about when they think about stalking. They think of these ex-partners who are kind of targeting they're usually men targeting women. The next 2 groups are both at the other end of the relationship kind of continuum, if you like. So they're seeking a relationship. They haven't had a relationship with the victim, but they want one. So the first group is what we call in my field the people who are incompetent suitors. So basically they're going about trying to get a relationship, but they don't have the skills to do that in a way that's socially acceptable. And so they do things that are frightening and that scare the person they're trying to initiate that relationship with. And so often in this group, They are people who desperately want to have connection with another person. They're lonely. They would like to have what all their peers have, which is meaningful, intimate relationships, but they kind of just don't get how you should do that. And maybe also they're someone who's not very appealing, so they're not going to be very successful in relationships, in establishing relationships, and so they do experience a lot of kind of knockbacks, but they're not able for various reasons. Often people in this group have various neurodevelopmental kind of issues, like intellectual disability, autism spectrum, these kinds of things. That's not causing them to stalk by any means, but it means that they've not necessarily got the skills and they're not responding well to that situation. And so in the process, they're frightening usually the women that they're trying to start relationships with. So they're a small group, but they're probably more common out there in the world than we see, because I'm guessing it probably happens quite a lot, but just doesn't get reported.
Do they tend to repeat offend as well?
Yeah.
Are they more likely to target more than one person?
That's right.
It's impossible to explore the psychology of crime without delving into the work of the FBI's Behavioural Analysis Unit, known as the BAU, or Criminal Profilers. This elite team combines cutting-edge psychological research with unparalleled investigative experience to decode criminal behaviour. Their insights have cracked some of the most baffling cases that left other law enforcement agencies at a standstill. In an interview with Crime Insider's forensics host Kathryn Fox, Julia shared a gripping account of her first case with the BAU, a haunting investigation into the murders of 2 young girls in a remote Oklahoma town.
One of the things I thought was, this person practices with his weapons. He's a good shot. He probably brags about it. So one of the investigative suggestions that I gave is to maybe go to shooting ranges and ask and inquire about people who come to their range, and do you have anybody who fits this profile? But that was one of the suggestions that I made, because I felt he practiced, that he liked to shoot and he practiced a lot. So when they laughed at me about, ma'am, everybody in Oklahoma has a gun, I had to explain that's not what I mean. This is more of an obsessive person who is going to brag and boast. The other thing that I felt strongly about, just based on what I observed at the crime scene, is when you think, these are very low risk victims. What on earth could cause somebody to do what this offender did to these girls? And I'm like, there couldn't be anything in the world for most people that an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old girl could do that would cause anybody to kill them. And so that takes a very distinct personality, a very cold-hearted personality. So I felt that people who know this person are going to know that he's dangerous. He's probably overreacted to certain situations, to perceived slights, that this is going to be a major component of his personality. And once he's identified, people are going to come out of the woodwork starting to tell stories about how dangerous they felt this person was. And so this is not your local hunter with a hunting rifle in his truck. This is somebody who is very dangerous and very scary. And that's where I really wanted them to focus on, that personality. And I said, when you find that person, when you start hearing stories about a person who has done something really horrible to other people, that's who you're looking for.
Not everybody reports assault, so that makes it even more difficult, particularly intimate partner or family violence. Were you then looking at previous crimes, assaults?
One of the things that I had suggested is they go back over people that they had contact with, particularly anybody who had the weapon that they were looking for. And they hadn't been able to contact every single person that they thought would have a Glock. They couldn't locate all the weapons. But taking these characteristics and going back over and looking at people that they've talked to and kind of overlaying that profile and asking these questions, have they ever done anything that was unexpected? Did they overreact to things? Have they ever lashed out at you for something that seemed very minor? That these are the types of people that you are looking at. So when you're starting to look at people that maybe have these particular weapons, do they have these character traits in their background? They might not necessarily have a criminal history. They might not necessarily have ever killed anyone before, but these are going to be characteristics that are reflected in their interpersonal relationships.
Did that give them any leads?
What ended up happening is an offender or a suspect came onto their radar because there was a young woman, she was 23 years old, who went missing. And she was supposedly going off to get married to her boyfriend, and his name was Kevin Sweat. So ultimately, investigation showed that Kevin, rather than going off and marrying her, he murdered her and burned her body on his grandfather's property, which was right near the crime scene. And he lived near one of the victims, the two girls. And during the interview of Kevin, the investigator said, he matches the profile. I think he killed the two girls as well. And he happened to be the same investigator that was the lead investigator on the two girls. So I got a phone call, and the investigators were telling me this guy matches the profile. And this was just a few months after I had been out to Oklahoma. And my initial response was disbelief in a way. I trusted them. I knew they were good investigators, but I also started thinking, I hope they don't have tunnel vision and think that everybody's going to fit, because I just thought this can't be happening so soon. And they have a suspect sitting right in front of him. And so as they started learning more information about him, they sent me pictures of him. And this guy, Kevin Sweat, had posted pictures of himself online posing with his guns. And they were very artsy types of photographs. And he certainly seemed to have this fascination with weapons. And when I saw the photos, that's what I was talking about. Maybe I didn't articulate it right, that you're going to have him posing with his guns. But when I said that this is somebody obsessed with weapons, this is what I was talking about. And I just had this feeling this is going to be him. And then they ended up doing a search warrant on his grandfather's property. And they found, or his father, I think it was his father's property. I can't remember if it was his father or his grandfather. But they found shell casings. And they found a makeshift gun range where somebody had been doing target practice, and the shell casings on the property matched the shell casings at the crime scene.
When you heard that, how did you actually feel?
It's a combination of exhilaration and sadness and relief. Certainly my role in an investigation like this, I'm detached. I'm not talking to victims' families. I'm not talking to the victims' friends. I'm not involved. I don't live in the community. So any happiness I have is for the investigators that do this kind of work day in and day out and spend their lives on these cases. And so I just felt very happy for the investigators as well, because I knew what a relief this was to them.
Your involvement didn't end there though, did it?
No, it didn't.
What did the police then ask you to do?
An interview strategy.
How do you set up an interview with someone who you think has no empathy? How do you make a strategy for the person doing the interviewing?
Well, certainly somebody like that, you can't really play on their emotions in terms of making them feel sympathy or empathy for the victims. Anything he says is going to be because it benefits him in some way. So you have to kind of play into that. The other thing that we knew is that the original investigator who had interviewed him the first time about the death of his fiancée had built a fairly good rapport with him. And he did admit to killing his fiancée, but he also sort of played like he was seeing things and he was crazy in a way. Even though he made admissions, he wasn't being accountable for what he did. He was saying, I saw things and it's, my mental illness made me do it, is basically what he was saying. So one of the things I told the investigators, I felt like the same investigator should interview him again because they have an established relationship and he's already admitted things to him in the past. And that if he tries to claim any kind of implausible thoughts or things, don't argue with him, just let him tell you the story. And certainly make it about him and not about the victims. And so ultimately, when he was interviewed, he told the investigator that he was on the road that day. He pulled over because he, and I'm going to quote him, needed to take a leak. And while doing so, he saw monsters coming at him and he had to shoot them. And then he got back in his car and then the monsters came at him again and he had to shoot them again. And so that was the story that he told. He didn't really move off that story. So it was an admission. He admitted to being there. He admitted to killing them, although he was blaming it on, delusions. But the other thing that I thought was really important about his admission was that the sequence of events that he described were what I believed had happened and what I had written in my report. And only the offender would know that. Only the offender would know how it played out. And even though it wasn't a pure confession, the investigators and the prosecutors felt it was a confession. Even though he tried to say he was, mentally ill at the time. But there was no indication that he was. He was evaluated and determined to be fit to stand trial.
I thought when you said he needed to pass urine by the side of the road, is that a euphemism? Is that some sort of excuse for him exposing himself?
I believed it to be. What he's admitting to, when we kind of look back on behavior and what is he saying? He's saying he exposed himself because if he was relieving himself on the side of the road, he would require him to expose himself to do so. So that's what he's telling us. And so what I believe likely happened is he exposed himself to the girls and they either recognized him because there was a connection. One of the girls' sisters had worked with him in a fast food restaurant at one point in time. So either one of them recognized him and said they were going to tell on him, or he just felt like, they're going to tell on me, so I just have to kill them. And I think that that's what the motive was. And I think for a lot of people, that's hard to believe that it could be something so minor like that. But for somebody, this personality type, it's not minor. And one of the stories that investigators learned from a prior girlfriend of the offender was she was on the telephone with him at one point and was trying to break up with him. And he told her on the phone, well, I'm going to kill myself. And he fires a gun. So she's on the other end of the telephone thinking, he's just killed himself. And she's horrified and she's screaming. And he gets back on the phone and he laughs. He says, what's the matter? I was just joking. What's wrong with you? And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about this abusive behavior that's shocking to people. This is the kind of person that would do what he did to these two victims and to his fiance. These are the types of behaviors that you'll see, these really shocking, unexpected behaviors. I'm not saying that everyone will do something exactly like that, but this really abusive and tormenting behavior that he had no qualms about engaging in, to horrify somebody, just to punish her for not wanting to date him any longer. And there's no indication that he's killed anybody else other than these three people, but he would have killed again, I believe. And certainly if he was in any relationships with anybody else, it would have been extremely abusive, emotionally and likely physically abusive as well.
What astounds me is that somebody like this, who you sort of, his lack of empathy, it's a dysfunctional personality really, his overreacting, it's not going to endear you to many people. And how on earth then does he have relationships with females to the point where he was engaged to one? He must be able to fake it, and yet he couldn't fake it in a police interview.
Yeah, he was very good at faking it. I mean, he did date women, but at first, it's like anyone else, he seemed just fine. Seemed like a nice guy, charismatic, and polite, and came across that way right at first. And then he'd get involved in these relationships, and then this other side would come out, and he would be extremely abusive. And it can be very difficult once you're involved in a relationship like that to get out of that relationship, particularly with someone who's so manipulative and frightening. Yeah, the other thing that I thought was really interesting, he would talk on the phone with his mother, and the investigators were sharing his jail calls with me so that I could get a better understanding of him. And prior to being charged with the murders of the girls, he'd been charged with the murder of his fiance, but he had not been charged with the murder of the girls. But his mother, he's on the phone with his mother, and his mother tells him, you're going to be charged with those murders. And his response to his mother was, what is this going to do to my reputation? So that was one of the things I said, use that in the interview. Use this would be good for your reputation if you tell the truth, things like that. But it really did seem like that was his concern, was his reputation.
And yet he was in prison at that time for killing his fiancée.
Right. Completely out of touch with the perception of who he was. Completely out of touch with reality. Not in a crazy way. He knew right from wrong. He definitely knew right from wrong, or if he didn't, I don't think he would have killed the girls, because he wouldn't realize what he was doing by exposing himself was wrong. And I should say he's never admitted to it's exposing himself to them. Like he's never admitted to that as the motive. That's what I think is likely the motive, just based on what he did say.
You can explain what he's done, but do you understand it?
No, I don't understand. A lot of times I think you see on TV and movies that profilers or investigators, they get into the minds of the killers, and I really don't do that. I don't think I'm capable of getting into their minds. I can explain things. I know logically there are people out there that can do things like this. I can explain it in a logical way, but in my heart, do I understand it? I don't understand it. I don't know that I ever will.